Okay, everyone, thanks and welcome back. Sorry we overran a little bit in the first session, but I've been assured by the chair here that he'll keep everybody to time now. So, it's my privilege to introduce Grahame Smith. For those that don't know Grahame, he is and has been General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress since 2006. Yep. And Grahame's going to lead this session on dimensions of inclusive growth. Over to Grahame.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Gary said, I'm the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, which is the representative body for trade unions in Scotland. I'm also a member of Scotland's Fair Work Convention. I'm delighted to have been asked to play a role in this important conference by chairing this session on dimensions of inclusive growth. I'm joined on the platform by three very eminent speakers. Professor Sir Harry Burns, the Professor of Global Health at the University of Strathclyde, Professor Sara Carter, Professor of Entrepreneurship, also at the University of Strathclyde, and Professor Patricia Findlay, the Professor of Work and Employment Relations, also from the University of Strathclyde. And Patricia is also the academic advisor to the Fair Work Convention. And as a graduate of Strathclyde University, this seems like a bit of a takeover, which is mildly subversive, given that we're in the Senate room at Glasgow University. I don't know if Anton's still around. While I'm the only person on the platform that doesn't hold a professorial position, today I'm the person who does hold the chair, and our speakers have been advised that I expect them to stick to their 12 minutes so that we can allow some time for questions once they've completed their presentations. So please be ready for questions when you've heard from our speakers. This morning we heard from our First Minister and others about Scotland's approach to economic development and our commitment to achieving inclusive growth through the mutually supportive goals of increasing competitiveness and tackling inequality. Through our strategic dialogue with the Scottish Government and its agencies, the Scottish TUC has had the opportunity to influence the Government's approach and its thinking around the economy and around the labour market. And I think our insight has played an important role in shaping the approach that we're taking in Scotland and in changing the nature of the conversation that we've been having about inclusion and about growth, something I've been striving for during my 30 or so years as a trade union activist and official. And while I recognise the tensions that exist, I believe that we've moved away from viewing inclusion and growth as competitive objectives or inclusion being dependent on growth to a recognition of their interdependencies. And I also believe we've come to recognise that our workplaces should be a central focus of our policy discourse. And what happens in our workplaces has implications, of course, for our economy, but also for our society, for our families, for our communities. And that achieving fair work in the dimensions that were set out by the Fair Work Convention, that's work that offers effective voice, opportunity, security, fulfilment and respect, and that balances the rights of workers and employers, is critical if we are to achieve a wider range of economic and social objectives. And I think it's also important to recognise that we've not allowed the absence of legislative competency in the areas of, for example, workplace and employment policy to deter us from trying to make progress. There is a strong argument for legislative authority over employment and trade union rights, for example, to rest with our Scottish Parliament. But, however, given that that's not currently the case, that means that the responsibility for action has fallen on the social partners, on unions and on employers, with government and its agencies required to consider how it can use other levers to achieve our shared objectives. Now, this morning's session addresses different but very much interrelated dimensions of inclusive growth. Professor Burns will outline the arguments for health objectives and outcomes that create the capability and capacity for people to play a full role in society and in the economy and in workplaces. Professor Carter will talk about the importance of entrepreneurship to the economy and society and the way in which entrepreneurship can play an important role in addressing issues around inclusion. And Professor Findlay will talk about the potential of inclusive growth to challenge assumptions about how value is created and shared, and about the crucial role of fair work in integrating the dimensions of inclusive growth as an alternative approach to creating value. We've much to cover, so please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Sir Harry Burns.
Okay, so we're all agreed that inclusive growth is a good thing, and in fact it's more than a good thing. I would argue that dealing with inequality, dealing with exclusion, dealing with alienation is probably necessary over the next 100 years to ensure the survival of our civilization. When you see is that my time up already? When you see the stresses and strains that are occurring across societies and, you know, in Myanmar at the moment and the refugees in Syria and so on, we really need to get a grip of this. The question is what's the method? If we don't have a method for tackling exclusivity, we are stuck. So what makes growth inclusive? The first thing is that people have to be able to be included. They need a certain level of skill, a certain level of education. They don't need perfect manners, but they need to be reasonably civilised and able to get along with each other and so on. And it helps if they don't have a criminal conviction, because that often excludes people entirely, and in my view, pretty unfairly, from work. The second thing, which is not always appreciated, and I learned this when I was a surgeon in the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow, you would see people coming in repeatedly with alcohol-related problems or drug-related problems. You say to them, you really need to stop drinking. Why should I bother? Well, you'll die. Who cares? What have I got to live for? The booze is the only pleasure I have in life. There are people whose lives are so miserable that they alienate themselves from society in general. So we have to be able to give people a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, if they're going to grasp the opportunities that a growing economy is going to give them. So as a doctor, I was trained in pathogenesis, the causes of disease. And it was only when I started to study public health that I came across this term, salutogenesis. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being and safety. And colleagues in the Nordic School of Public Health have adopted this term, salutogenesis, to describe what drives well-being, what drives wellness. The people in the East End, too much illness wasn't their problem, it was not enough wellness. So how did we create it? And there are about 25 different theories up there, and I've actually read most of them. And given that the chairman's going to cut me off in a few minutes, I'll just summarise them for you. Having an optimistic outlook, being positive about life, having a sense of control and an internal sense of control. I make my decisions. They're not made for me by some faceless bureaucrat in the Department of Work and Pensions. Sense of purpose and meaning in life. I have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, and I'm confident that the problems that I encounter, I will find my way through those problems. But critically, in my view, the projects that I have seen that are transformative often centre around a single significant adult mentor for someone to learn from. So if you put all of that together, it begins to give us a method for seeing how we can create well-being in communities where well-being is at short supply. What's important and what people don't realise, and what a lot of depends on where on the political spectrum you are, but this notion that people make choices, actually, the lower down the social scale, the more turbulent your childhood, the less ability you've got to make choices, and there are biological reasons for that. Studies have shown that chaotic childhood leads to differential pattern of brain growth, and the key areas of the brain that are less well developed are the prefrontal cortex, which allows you to take new information in and act appropriately. Kids who come from chaotic backgrounds are less well able to act appropriately in stressful situations. The hippocampus, important for memory, integrates short and long-term memory. They're less well able to learn. The amygdala becomes more active, and that's the centre of emotional arousal. So you put together a child who is less well able to learn, who's emotionally switched on, anxious, aggressive, fearful, and less well able to suppress inappropriate behaviour, you've got problems. You've got kids who are excluded from school, who are going to fail in school. The single biggest determinant of educational failure in major studies has been witnessing domestic violence in the home. We didn't just take all this laboratory stuff as granted. We went out and measured the size of these areas and the density of these areas by doing scans in affluent and deprived Scots. And that's what we find. This is a picture of the hippocampus. It's okay, you don't need to bother too much about it. And you link that to the major studies that link chaotic childhood, chaotic families with outcome. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study in California, looked at 9 different types of neglect or abuse, neglect, emotional neglect, and parental absence through parental substance misuse, parental mental health problems, domestic violence, parental incarceration. The more of these adverse events a child experienced, the more likely he or she was to become an alcoholic. The ACEs study, kids who had 4 or more adverse experiences in early life were 8 times more likely to become alcoholics, about 11 times more likely to engage in narcotics abuse. Boys who experienced physical violence at the hands of an older male, 8 times more likely to engage in partner violence, 4 times more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. The learned behaviour plus the problems they've got in developing an appropriate interaction with society leads to failure. The ACEs study calculated that 1 year's worth of child neglect in the United States brought with it a lifetime cost to the US economy of $124 billion. In terms of costs of care, costs of healthcare, costs of incarceration, and failure to engage with the jobs market. Now, on a pro rata basis, that's £1.9 billion for the Scottish economy. Fix society, fix families, support children in early life. You save a hell of a lot of money later on, but that's not why we should do it. We should do it because it's the right thing to do. The Dunedin cohort, South Island of New Zealand, recruited 1,000 children in the early 70s, identified a subgroup of them as coming from a chaotic background. Now in their 40s, these children are more likely to have had criminal convictions for violence, more likely to have experienced teenage pregnancy, more likely to be substance misusers, and are beginning to show biological signs of risk of conditions like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and so on. Physical ill health follows these behavioural engagement problems that we see. So studies all over the place show the link between chaotic families and adverse outcome and lack of engagement with society as a whole. The adverse childhood events, what colleagues at Glasgow Centre for Population Health and Glasgow University Public Health Department and so on have shown is that the major drivers of inequality and mortality in Scotland are drugs, alcohol, suicide and violence-related deaths. Not heart disease, not cancer, but socially determined problems of deaths in young working age people. That's the pattern of chronic disease from drugs, alcohol, suicide, and the blue squares are heart disease and cancer. It's the problem of the pattern of inequality in death rates that you see in the ACEs study. And if you put alongside that the pattern of deaths associated with Glasgow, that's Glasgow, the excess deaths in Glasgow compared to English cities like Liverpool and Manchester, you see a striking comparison. So if we're going to create a society where everyone can be included and participate and engaged, we need to look at families and we need to look at making sure that children get the best possible start. What we can see here is that chaotic early years leads to an increased risk of mental health and behavioural problems in children. They go to school, they get excluded from school, they disappear around the back of the shopping centre, get a bottle of vodka, get into a fight, before you know where they are, they're in jail. And if you talk to these kids in jail, as I have done, I'm a regular attender in Scotland's jails and usually they let me out. What are you going to do? You're 18, you've been in jail, what are you going to do when you get out? I'll never get a job. I've got a criminal record. So what are you going to do? Well, I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly and I'll drink. The lack of self-efficacy, the lack of self-esteem, the lack of control is already built in. What they don't factor into that equation is the fact that the girlfriend will have a baby or two. And the baby is born into the chaotic circumstances, and the cycle continues. We have to break that cycle by tackling the chaos that young people are living in at the moment. What my proposition is that, and I see hundreds of projects around the place where they are successful in engaging people and transforming their lives, but they're small projects. We need to do this at scale. The whole of society needs to reorientate itself to doing the right thing for people who are going to be excluded. On the left-hand side, we've got an existing public sector system, which is rational. You've got a drug problem, mate. You're a health problem. Okay? You've got debt arrears. Okay, we're going to evict you from your house. That's the way we kind of react rationally to these things. We identify problems. Our system responds to crises. We implement solutions that do things to people. We make their decisions for them, thereby undermining them even more. It's essentially run by professionals for professionals, and we have a risk management culture. We want to be efficient because it's public money after all, and we want to play it safe. The projects that I have seen, both in the third sector and in the public sector, that are most successful are normative. They ask, what's a normal life? How do we help you acquire and reach a normal life? What matters to you? And when you ask people in difficulty what matters to them, it's not, I need more money for drugs. It's actually, my kids are unsafe because there's no fence around the front garden. That is an actual case. A woman who was suicidal because her children who had learning difficulties kept wandering away. The problem was no one would build a fence around their front garden because they needed a health and safety assessment. And when they just built the damn fence, everything settled down. So we need to ask people what matters to them. We build support, we build networks of people who work on solutions themselves. Solutions emerge from the bottom up. The citizen is at the centre of this kind of thing, and they get purpose and meaning in life because they begin to take control. Here is an example. The first example I saw was from the Beacon and Old Hill Estate in Falmouth, where occupation disappeared. Just one more, I think, after this. Where things okay, one more minute, right. Employment disappeared in this estate when the Naval Dockyard closed down. It became a basket case with extreme violence and neglect and so on. 2 health visitors turned this place around. By activating, they got 5 members of the estate to come together, and they started doing things. They just went out and cut the grass. They started fixing things and making it look pretty. Over the next 8 years, this was the result they got. Crime down 50%, employment up 70%, child protection registrations down, teenage pregnancy almost disappeared. 2 health visitors. Stoke-on-Trent did a similar thing and they looked at the cost the most chaotic families were costing public services. They costed what they were spending per person on public services as about £100,000 per person. They implemented this different interaction. We will help you fix your problem. Costs went down to about £2,000. Costs in terms of social services almost disappeared. Local authority costs, health service costs, police costs. The only public sector where costs went up was education, and that was because more children were going to school. So finally, what we would see as the challenge is that individuals from chaotic backgrounds are going to fail. They're more likely to go to jail and be unhealthy. And supporting people to take control of their lives through alleviating poverty, supporting them to discover skills, will allow them to participate in a flourishing economy, but we've got to do it at scale. And if I can just quote Adam Smith, like the First Minister did, in the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith said, there is something in us that requires us to see the happiness of others, even although we derive no profit from it, except the pleasure of seeing it. That is the reason we should do things. It's a human need that we must stretch our hands out and meet. Not because it grows the economy, it's because it's the right thing to do.
Thanks very much, Harry. Our next speaker is Professor Sara Carter. Sara, going to talk about the importance of entrepreneurship to the economy and society and the role that plays in addressing inclusion.
Thank you very much, Grahame. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to present on dimensions of inclusive growth. As it's been said, I'm going to talk about entrepreneurship, and I feel a little odd because I think entrepreneurship is often seen as the absolute antithesis of inclusive growth. It's become synonymous with a small group of extremely overly wealthy, maybe undertaxed. Trying to... Yeah, I've got it. Sorry, I will start in a minute. I just want to give you pictures as well. Well, if I can carry on talking then, and we'll start the slides when we can. So entrepreneurship has been sort of synonymous with a sort of the opposite of inclusive growth. And when I ask my students who they think about when they think about an entrepreneur, they will say people like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, and they very rarely indicate the local people that they know much better. And so what I would like to do is perhaps focus less on these kind of undertaxed superstars of Silicon Valley and actually start thinking about more local entrepreneurs that I talk with all the time. People like Rosie Aribe, who started a knitwear company in Galashiels back in the mid-1980s as soon as she graduated. And she has built up a network of knitters that, and an avid fan base. She sells to 16 countries around the world and online. People like Kevin Wilson and Pam Wilson, who started a building company in Stirling and have built up a number of employees and apprentices, and who have recently celebrated their 10th birthday in business. And also people like Lena Adura, a woman originally from West Africa who started 3 businesses and sells, again, internationally, as well as supplying the local community. So it's people like the very ordinary, everyday entrepreneurs that I want to be talking about in my speech today. Now, we've talked a lot about broad economic measures, and I think it's worth saying what exactly the small business sector looks like in the UK or in Scotland. In common with all other developed economies, nearly all of Scotland's businesses are small firms. 70% are self-employed with no employees, 28% have between 1 and 49 employees, and medium and large firms actually count for just over 1% of our business base. In total, small firms account for 98% of all of our enterprises, 56% of all of our employment, that's 1.2 million jobs in Scotland, and 39% of all turnover. Thank you. So I'm back on track now. Okay, but beyond the kind of broad kind of economic measures, I think it's also important to recognise that small firms play a particular contribution beyond that. And if we look at the characteristics of, for example, our 300,000 self-employed people in Scotland, what we'll see is that it involves a growing number of women, a growing number of ethnic minorities, a number of people for whom self-employment is actually a second job, for example, Uber drivers, and also, and perhaps this is just as importantly, it employs or it involves a disproportionately high number of our citizens with disabilities and long-term health limitations who are often unable to work within the formal labour market. Now, I would like to focus on the experiences of these non-traditional entrepreneurs because they face specific barriers to participation. And we often talk about the 3 M's of participation: access to money, access to markets, and frankly, misplaced concerns about their managerial competency. Now, with regard to access to finance, this is a big one. Women and ethnic minority entrepreneurs often talk about specific barriers that they face, real concerns, and these concerns are actually based on facts. Because when we compare the firms started by, for example, men and women who are starting businesses in the same sectors, in the same place, at the same time, what we see is that women-led firms actually use just 1/3 of overall capitalisation that is used by men. Women-owned firms have much lower ratios of external debt finance, a much greater reliance on personal savings and informal friends and family capital, and they make very scarce use of venture capital. Well, in actual fact, that's not really a surprise because most small firms don't use venture capital. In fact, there's more examples of people starting their businesses having won the lottery than using venture capital. And even in the US, which is the home of the venture capital industry, women command just 2% of the venture capital dollar. Now, the reasons for these differences in finance usage are quite complex, and it's not just about, and in fact it's not at all about, bank discrimination. There's almost no evidence of supply-side discrimination going on. What we see is a lot of discouragement, people who don't apply for finance because they think they're going to be rejected. And here I have to say that fear of rejection is actually higher than rates of rejection. It looks like what's going on is that when people start businesses, they're highly debt averse. They don't want to get into debt. And when they go to banks and talk about borrowing small amounts of money, their perceptions of what they want to do and the bank lending officers' perceptions of what a women-owned business looks like interact to co-produce a lending outcome that means that when women start businesses, they don't start with enough financial resources behind them. And this matters, and it matters because there's a correlation between initial capitalization and long-term business performance. So when we examine matched samples of men and women who have started their businesses with the exact same resource base, guess what? The performance of those businesses is the exact same. The problem is one of starting resources, and on average, women-led and ethnic minority-led firms start with less. But this is not, and I reiterate this, it is not a problem derived from a lack of skill, it is a problem entirely derived from a lack of resources. Now, with regards to access to markets, we see enormous barriers, in particular for minority-owned enterprises, and a dependence among these firms on co-ethnic markets. And the problem here is that these markets are often as poor and as restrictive as and insufficiently good for their purposes. And their need is to break out of these hyper-competitive market niches and diversify into more lucrative mainstream markets. Now, this kind of work, participation of ethnic minorities in sort of market access initiatives, has been the focus of much of the work in the UK and also in the US. And we also see it for women. In the UK, there is an organisation called We Connect. It's an international organisation, but it operates very well in the UK. And it works with multinational companies to diversify their supply base, allowing women-owned firms to actually access major customers. Now, these kinds of initiatives would be really helpful for all small businesses, not just women-owned and ethnic minority firms. Now, with regard to management, I've already alluded to the so-called underperformance of women-owned firms that typically lack resources. But it's also worth mentioning here that there's something else going on when we look at ethnic minority firms, and that is there's often a mismatch between very highly skilled and professionally credentialised people and their self-employed positioning. However, I've got to say it's not all bad news. So this is, here we are. So this conference is about growth as well as about inclusion. And I want to address recent media articles that have highlighted the precarity of the self-employed in a discourse on income poverty that typically depicts low median incomes of the self-employed as the sole indicator of their economic well-being. But when we analysed the UK Wealth and Assets Survey, what we found was that households of small business owners were actually significantly better off than other households, including households of employees. So small business owning houses have twice the total wealth in the form of assets of employee households, about £475,000 versus £246,000. More than 20% of small business owning households are in the top decile, and more than 50% are in the top 3 deciles. In fact, small business owning households comprise just 2% of all households, but 4% of total wealth. And we see the same trend for the self-employed households too. They account for 6% of all households, but 7% of total wealth in the country. And also, whilst entrepreneurship is associated with very high levels of inequality, it's also worth noting that inequalities among entrepreneurs are actually lower than among the inactive and the unemployed. In fact, inequalities among the entrepreneurs, the small business owners, are on a par with employees. Now, I started this talk by essentially talking about how ordinary, everyday entrepreneurs are completely overshadowed by these Silicon Valley superstars. So what should we be talking about when we talk about the real lives of small business owners? And here I think what we've got to do is to focus not on the individual. This is not an entrepreneurial hero we're dealing with. We're actually dealing with households. And when we think about how entrepreneurs manage the risk and insecurity that is so associated with their occupation, what we see is that the risk and insecurity is managed not by the individual, but it's managed at the level of the household. And it is the household that not only controls very tightly the expenditure that goes out of the household, it also sets the strategic business decisions for the firm. So when we look at small firms and we say they're not economically rational, that's because small firms are not making decisions on the basis of economic rationality. They're making decisions based on their household need. So households are involved in mediating, moderating, and managing the business and the business risk. A surprising number of small firms also depend on social transfers, for example, child benefit or even some pensions. And what they use this for is to basically provide their daily provisions, and any income that is derived from the business actually offers the possibility of higher living standards. So they have the kind of a very small cushion which pays for everything, and their frugal lifestyles can actually adapt to that, but business growth gives them jam tomorrow. And again, I think this is one of the most important features of the sector. Rather than the extravagant borrowings and very high levels of debt that we associate with entrepreneurship, the vast majority of small businesses very tightly control their resources, and they control their investment of time and money. And I have to say that in an era of uncertainty and disruption, we should all be very thankful for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. The final speaker in this session is Professor Patricia Findlay. Patricia is going to talk about the importance of inclusive growth to challenging assumptions about how value is created, and the crucial role of fair work in integrating the dimensions of inclusive growth. Patricia.
Good morning, everyone, and I think it is still morning. Today I want to focus very briefly on two key and interrelated or interlinked issues. The first, I think, is the need to reflect a bit more on the relationship between inclusion and growth in order to improve our understanding of what is distinctive about inclusive growth and, crucially, about how to make it a reality. The second and related issue I wish to highlight is the importance of fair work as a key driver of inclusive growth. So like everyone in this room, I imagine, I very much welcome the rising international interest in inclusive growth and its central role in Scotland's economic strategy. But I do wonder whether or not people still struggle with what it means in practice. Definitions, such as these ones here from the OECD and the Scottish Government, focus quite heavily on two key elements: the importance of creating opportunities for all to participate and the need to distribute the benefits of growth fairly. Harry and Sara have both talked in different ways about the challenges of providing more than formal opportunities to participate for some or all of our citizens. So these two key elements, which come out across a whole host of definitions of inclusive growth, are important, and they are, of course, linked, because it is the participating that leads to the sharing in the benefits. As Ranieros and Ramos argued in 2013, participation without benefit sharing makes growth unjust, and sharing benefits without participation makes it a welfare outcome. So these core elements I want you to focus on, participating and sharing in benefits, I think help explain the attractiveness of inclusive growth as an idea to people who are primarily interested in inclusion. But what does that mean about growth, and what does it have to say about growth? In many expositions of inclusive growth, the growth effect stems, it is hoped, from having more people involved in economic activity and the positive economic ripples from more widely shared prosperity. Arguably, however, that's only part of the answer. What seems underdeveloped in discussions of inclusive growth is what comes between participating in economic life and sharing in its rewards, which is the process of creating value. And I think we need to focus a bit more on understanding how inclusive growth relates to value creation. So let's think about a very simple value process. A variety of capitals or resources are assembled in some way, including people. Valuable goods, services and knowledge are created through different types of production or transformation process, and value is realised and distributed to a variety of people in a variety of ways, and of course in very different shares. While people are formed in families, communities, nurseries, schools, colleges and universities, the core domain in which they create value is the workplace, and we need to focus on the workplace. Acknowledging this doesn't underestimate what happens before people enter the workplace or after they leave it. Neither does it underestimate the interaction of work with other spheres, most notably families, nor the creation of social values in communities, public and third sector organisations. It simply reflects the reality that economic value is created through work, and therefore work is crucial to the prosperity, health and well-being of most people and of every society. Given this, therefore, what happens at work and the characteristics of work are of huge importance. This is acknowledged in Scotland with the establishment of the Fair Work Convention and the commitment of government to the Convention's Fair Work framework. Yet I suspect that many people see fair work as solely in terms of inclusion and equity. And of course it is and should be about both of those things. Fair work is driven by what we believe to be right. But fair work also reflects a different way of creating value and growth, and so in my view provides the crucial linkage that's sometimes underdeveloped in inclusive growth discussions. Grahame mentioned earlier the definition of inclusive growth in Scotland, and you'll see that it's a relatively expansive definition which focuses on effective voice, opportunity, security, fulfilment and respect. Those dimensions together focus on ensuring that workers have the opportunity to participate on equal terms in work, a constructive role in value creation through high quality jobs, and benefit from how that value is distributed. Fair work, therefore, is a fundamentally important mechanism for driving inclusive growth. Much of my own research focuses on the implications of good and bad jobs. Let's be very clear, bad jobs do not support inclusive growth. The impacts are more evident for individuals. If you have a poor quality job, you're more likely to live in poverty, in working life and beyond it. Your children are more likely to live in poverty. Your chances of accessing training and development are lower. Your health outcomes will be worse, relative to people in good jobs, but also relative to people who are unemployed, as recent evidence from Tirani Chandrola on levels of chronic stress has made clear. But it isn't just the individuals in bad jobs who lose out. Businesses miss out on the benefits that we know good work brings: more engaged, committed and adaptable workers who identify challenges, solve problems, offer insights and ideas for business improvement, and create value. So poor work costs all of us. It imposes welfare and healthcare costs on society, diminishes tax revenues, creates and exacerbates problems for families and communities. It fails to harness the returns from the education and skills in which we've all invested. And it drags down productivity, innovation and growth. We know that many of the practices associated with high quality work are more prevalent in societies and economies with higher productivity and higher rates of business innovation than Scotland and the UK. In Scotland, I think we've been very much at the forefront of recognising the importance of what happens in the workplace and in expansive discussions of job quality, though there remain many mountains to climb. But fair work integrates the pursuit of inclusion and growth. And each of the 5 dimensions of the Fair Work framework span the key elements that I've argued are fundamental to inclusive growth: participating, creating and benefiting. And I'll talk a bit briefly across the dimensions on those. Our first dimension of effective voice enables individuals to participate in decision-making at work, resolve problems and conflicts, and so enhances their work experience. It can also be creative, engaging worker voice constructively in improving organisational performance. Effective voice, particularly through trade unions, supports fairer distribution, at a micro level in terms of pay and conditions, and at a macro level in supporting wider social priorities, including anti-poverty strategies and pay equality. I think we've got a slide stuck. Okay, we're there. Fair opportunity enables participation in work and also training, development and progression. And that improves life chances and improves social mobility. Fair opportunity means removing irrelevant barriers so that employers and employees can focus on merit, performance and contribution. This can improve organisational reputation, recruitment and retention, and leads to diverse workplaces with a richness of talent and a diversity of ideas. Society also benefits when fair opportunity breaks down labour market inequalities, reduces the costs of inefficient resource allocation, and helps create a more equitable and a much more cohesive society. Security and stability of employment, income and working hours underpin participation not simply in work, but participation in family, community and civic life. Where people are secure, this supports trust and commitment, increases their ability to learn, adapt and change, and to deliver discretionary effort, all of which creates value. Employers benefit from these outcomes and from lower turnover and from avoiding wasted training costs. So employers and workers can share in the benefits of secure work, and we as a society can avoid the negative externalities associated with insecure work that we're all very familiar with. Our fourth dimension, fulfilling work, underpins self-belief and self-worth, and that supports participation. Where an individual's sense of purpose is compatible with organisational purpose, this can be hugely productive and hugely rewarding. Fulfilling work where people have the opportunity to use their skills and talents to good effect helps unleash creativity and innovation, which we need for competitiveness. And fulfilling work is an important non-monetary benefit that people value highly. Our last dimension, respect at work, enhances individual health, safety and well-being and supports continued participation. Dignified treatment protects workers from work-related illness and injury and creates an environment free from bullying and harassment. Respectful relationships at work can improve communication and social exchange, encourage idea generation and learning, and we know that supportive workplace relationships cushion workers from workplace stress. So for all of us who are aware of the stress in our own work, we know how important respect at work is in supporting us in that context. respectful relations earned at work also have a spin-off effect in greater cohesion in the workplace and beyond. All of these dimensions taken together recognise the importance of workers having a sense of purpose and self-efficacy, a sense of being empowered, having control, the ability to be resourceful and the ability to make a difference, all of which we know from research are highly valued and, as Harry noted earlier, inextricably related to well-being. Scotland has a high employment rate, not even, but high overall. Improving the participation of those underrepresented in employment is crucially important, but equally important is ensuring that those in employment have fair work. Work that supports individuals, work that supports businesses to deliver effective and innovative performance, reduces the cost to all of us of poor quality work, and enhances the emancipatory and economic outcomes of work. Fair work, like inclusive growth, offers the tantalising prospect of a win-win scenario, though we cannot underestimate the rise of business models based on poor quality work that focus on short-term returns for some rather than stable long-term returns for many. But if we can enhance fair work in Scotland, we can create the kind of virtuous circle from which we all benefit, and we can deliver more inclusive growth. This means engaging with direct and indirect workplace stakeholders and using a range of policy levers to support fair work. It means paying attention to human capital formation, which speakers have talked about this morning, but it also means paying attention to human capital deployment. What happens to people when they use their human capital in the workplace? It means using a range of interconnected policy levers to support fair work. None of this is easy, but delivering fair work is an investment in everyone and for everyone that I think lies very much at the heart of inclusive growth. Thank you.
So we are running a wee bit behind time, but I made a promise that I would take some questions. So if there are any, you'll have a chance to raise and address some of these issues in the workshop. So don't feel you have to ask a question here. But if anybody does want to ask a question, I'll maybe take a couple if they can make them brief and if they can make the contributions from our panel. We've got one at the back and one there. And so colleague at the back, if you say who you are, and there's a microphone, I think, floating around somewhere. So the colleague at the back there. Right at the back in the middle. And if it's directly to one of the panel, if you could say who the question's for.
James Dunbar, Chief Executive, New Start Highland. So Harry, it's a question for you. You described the life-changing good work of some projects in the public and third sector for people who've experienced significant exclusion. How can we make this work mainstream, as you alluded to?
Okay, I'll take the other question, and then Harry, you can give you. You'll need a couple of minutes to think up the answer.
Thank you. My name is Neil McInroy. I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. It's a question to Patricia, and I completely agree with you, Patricia. It's about fair work, and I love your presentation. I just want you to sort of consider, to what extent do you feel that it's about ownership of the workplace in terms of co-ops, mutuals, and other forms of employment ownership that's equally important as well as wages and work?
Okay. Harry?
How can we mainstream this? That's something that occupies most of my waking thoughts. One of the things we've learned over the past few years is that we can make major change in public sector performance through involving frontline staff. The Patient Safety Project, the Early Years Collaborative and so on, it wasn't diktats coming from ministers, it was frontline staff getting together and saying, we know what will work, and they try it, and if it works, we spread it, and if it doesn't work, we move on to the next thing. It's a method that has been used extensively. You know, for example, the British cycling team, marginal gains across a whole range of areas. It's possible to do this. I've seen public sector organisations. The Wheatley Group, for example, Scotland's largest housing association, has a Think Yes programme in which all its frontline staff are trained to support people in difficulty. And housing officers in the Stoke-on-Trent example were absolutely crucial in identifying chaotic families. So it can be done, but it requires will on the part of senior staff as well as frontline staff. And I'm happy to say I've got about 5 local authorities in Scotland who want to try it. So, fingers crossed.
Thanks, Harry. Patricia, you want to pick up the other question?
Can I very quickly come in on that? I think one of the things about mainstreaming is actually around how we lever public spend. And I think we can use public spend very effectively to mainstream. I think we also, as Harry says, have to think about designing people to have jobs and responsibilities that allow them to be expansive and to respond to the needs of the client groups that they serve. On the ownership issue, I'm always a bit torn about this. The statistics on employee ownership tell us that there's a lot of good that goes on in employee-owned organisations, but it's not all good. So I think that they're an important element of the economy, but I think the vast majority of people are not in employee-owned firms. And I think what we need to do is to understand what the effects of ownership are, but also to understand much more what it is about employee ownership. Is it about that direct engagement in decision making, that responsibility, that shared information and shared responsibility for outcomes, which produces the beneficial outcomes that's sometimes associated with employee ownership, and how transferable are some of those to an employed context? And I think quite a lot of what we know about that tells us that in terms of designing jobs, roles and responsibilities, a lot of that is quite transferable.
Sara, do you have any comments you want to make on either of these two issues?
Well, I think I'd like to go back to the first question and talk about sort of mainstreaming kind of, sort of key issues, because I think that there is a really important issue around markets and access to markets. And we've seen some really astonishingly good work in terms of kind of linking small local companies up with them, sort of the major sort of multinationals. And I think that that's the kind of initiative that if we could mainstream that, because so many small firms are excluded from markets through procurement problems. So anything we can do to ease procurement access for small firms, I think would be very much appreciated.
Colleagues, I'm sure you'll agree we've had 3 excellent presentations, lots of issues that we could discuss in this session, I'm sure, for the next hour or so. We don't have that time, but I'd like you to, but as I said earlier, there'll be an opportunity in the workshops, of course, to pick up some of these themes, but for the moment I'd like you to join me in thanking our 3 participants. And Gary's going to, I think, advise us on the next part of the programme.
Okay, so we're now into the workshop sessions, the first of which starts now, and we've got 3 workshops, so they're colour-coded with your badges. So the red group, if they stay in here, workshop 2, the blue, are in Turnbull room, which is just along the corridor, and workshop 3, yellow, in the Melville room. So the workshops are an opportunity to get into a smaller scale, a chance to talk and discuss what we've heard this morning so far. The 3 we've got, Naomi will lead the session in here, overcoming exclusion from growth. We've got Susan Love, who will lead the other session around SME challenges and opportunities. And we've got Lorenzo Fioramonte, who will lead the innovations in policy and wellbeing. So we've got an hour each for these sessions, and then we'll go straight into lunch. Okay, thank you very much.